Thank you. Nicholas Martinez.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the Commission for allowing me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Nicholas Martinez. I kind of represent myself in a couple different ways here. I am a staff member of the Miami Downtown Development Authority, which is an independent agency of the City of Miami here in downtown. I'm also a former election administrator, having worked for 6 years at the Leon County Supervisor of Elections here in Florida. And I'm also a PhD student at FIU, where my research is all in election administration. So I look at election administration from a number of different perspectives. Specifically, I wanted to comment about the number, location, management of polling locations. Prior to the 2012 elections, our organization over time has traditionally been a commercial district. And within the last 10 to 15 years, we had a number of condos built, and all of a sudden our population boomed in downtown Miami. I came to the organization and did some analytics on the changing demographics and tried to work with the elections department, and we worked very closely together to identify new polling locations that could meet the needs of the voters who were in downtown Miami. And we were unable to find new locations, and one of the polling locations that was kind of still being filmed on election night was in downtown Miami on Brickell Avenue. So that was part of the residents in our district. I just wanted to tell that story to underscore the need of election administrators to continue to monitor their communities at the microgeography level to see how swingings in population can really dramatically affect their ability to manage a precinct. Additionally, we heard a lot of conversation about data today, and having been an election administrator and behind the firewall, essentially, they actually capture a lot of data right now. There's a lot of data in there, and a lot of the technology we talk about today, poll books and continue to add technology to the system is going to provide more data, and that's good for my friends in academia, but there needs to be staff who are in place to leverage big data, right? This management term, and data scientists who can provide real-time analytics to try and influence changing practice as it's happening. So it's too late if we look at an election post-election to see what happened. We need to try and, as administrators, take the data that we're getting and change our practice during the election to try and mitigate any negative effects going forward. On the comment, I'd like to make a comment as well on the efficient management of voter rolls and poll books. As I said, I was an election administrator for 6 years, and one of the things we tried to do in Leon County was to bring in poll books, and some of the supervisors mentioned it earlier today. Some of the vendors have too much control over the systems. So we weren't able to go and bring in other vendors, competing vendors, to try and utilize different technology, because our particular vendor had a lock on our ability to transmit the voter activity directly to the system. So we would have had to have come after the fact, many hours after the fact of the closing of election, early voting day, and then update the records, which was not real time and would have been completely kind of antithetical to the idea of trying to add the technology. So the more we talk about this, the more technology, the more vendors may get involved, but the more the vendors get involved, there has to be kind of an eye toward the needs of the election administrators and their ability to be flexible and bringing different vendors together. And as we talk about more technology, we also talk about more technical staff. And it's not only technical staff in terms of your full-time professional staff, but your poll workers. We know we have an aging poll worker population, and we want to add new technology. This is not exactly something that works well together. So there's poll worker trainings, and it become even more complicated. Did want to make a couple last comments on absentee ballot programs. I know the post office took some shots today. I worked very hard with the post office in 2007 to bring the intelligent mail barcode to implement it for election mail. And we implemented it in Leon County for the 2008 general election cycle, and was very successful. And The post office has a number of resources available, mail piece design analysts. They have regular calls with election administrators. They're very much willing to help. When I think it's, I would recommend to the commission to have a conversation with the Postal Service to say, what are you doing to assist the elections offices, and look at what the resources they've provided, because they're very much willing to help. They understand this is a growth niche for them. And more specifically on intelligent mail is capturing scans of the mail, and it gives election administrators the ability to see and be proactive in terms of responding to voter complaints, and also gives you another data source to do these analytics. So there's a lot of technology out there, a lot of ability to do analytics, but there's still kind of this question on professional ability within election staffs to be able to accomplish these things. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan Nolan.
Mr. Bauer, Ms. Ginsburg, Commissioners, thank you very much for this opportunity to address you today. My name's Dan Nolan, also from SOE Software. We do elections modernization tools for election officials around the world. And I just want to take a moment to join Supervisor Lori Edwards in saying how impressed I am with the diversity and the depth of skills and knowledge that come with this commission. You have folks from the business world where I come from, folks from the military world that I come from, and also folks that have worked in the election world when I came here. I'm a recent transplant to Florida, arrived here in 2001 from my former job as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Forces in Kosovo. Spent a couple of years here, and my wife looked around and said, well, I don't know what your next assignment is, but this is mine. So we decided to retire there in Tampa because it's a beautiful place. And then somebody said, would you like to come work in the elections business? And I said, well, can you describe it to me? He said, well, sure. On a certain day at a certain time, you need to open up 340 storefronts in dilapidated locations staffed by minimally trained, often elderly people to entice in a reluctant customer to participate in a process that they don't really understand. I said, oh, sounds like combat, I'll do it. And I had just come from places like the Fusion Center at Central Command, where we had all the tools necessary to execute complex operations. And I found that election officials really didn't have those tools because they are slow to adopt, because they need to be. But the technology today supports another way to look at this. But I'm not going to talk to you about that today. I'm going to presume to offer you some advice. The International Foundation for Election Systems has, in a recent study, talked about 3 fundamental challenges to electoral systems. The first is systemic manipulation, the second is electoral malpractice, and the final is fraud. Now, systemic manipulation is the intentional legal effort to influence the outcome of elections. And overlong ballots, the 2011 law that we had that limited early voting, voter ID laws that are ostensibly meant to prevent fraud but are really intended for intimidation. Those are examples of systemic manipulation. But that requires a legal process, that requires legislation, and may not necessarily be in your charter. Now, the electoral malpractice, while it sounds bad, it's really about doing bad things, but not intentionally. It's about human error. And it's about those unintentional acts that happen when a voter mismarks a ballot, when that stray pencil mark goes across the bubble that you didn't mean to and the machine can't read it, so we have a marred ballot, and now 3 people have to decide, what did you really intend to do? Or it's a bad signature by a voter. When I registered to vote in Huntington Beach, California in my signature is very different today than that. So there's a challenge that the election officials have in doing that sort of eyeball determination. Is this person eligible? Is this person capable of voting? A third of undeliverable ballots for UOCAVA voters. I mean, that hit home with me. I've had ballots chase me across continents, but when I got to the forward operating base in Kosovo, I had an internet connection. And when you hear that one of the challenges that the supervisor from Bay County has in his security procedures is to make sure he has tight control of pens and pencils around ballots, that tells you a little bit about the security of that system. Is there better things that we could be doing? And finally, we haven't heard an awful lot about fraud today, but we have heard an awful lot in sort of previous discussions. Of those three buckets of systemic manipulation, electoral malpractice, human error, I would recommend to you that you focus on these processes. Look at ISO 9000, look at Six Sigma, and look at the processes and where human error, when that ballot is handled by multiple people, where that is induced in the system, and see if there isn't a way that we can bring technology to bear to eliminate much of that. There is a better way. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Rosie Pastrana. Not present. John Quinn.
Good afternoon. Thanks for letting me speak today. My name is John Quinn. I am the Broward County spokesman for FloridaIndependent.org. I represent 2.5 million registered voters here in Florida that are not Democrats and not Republicans. We don't have a vote in the primaries here, even though we are 22% of the electorate. There are 18 other states in this country that don't allow independents to vote in the first round of voting. And there are several other states that require an independent voter to sign up with their party in order to vote in the primaries. We are independent for a reason. We don't like the gridlock caused by Democratic or Republicans' inability to work together. We may have similar views to both parties, but we don't want to be controlled by a party, and we are not loyal to a party, but rather to America. The President, in establishing this commission, has mandated you to operate in a nonpartisan manner. In order to do that, I urge you to take a look at how 40% of electorate nationwide are limited to the election process. We represent every race and are growing in number. Perhaps you chose Florida because of what happened in the state's voting process in 2012. I would like to know, from where I stand, what the Commission is going to do about the inadequacies of the voting process as it applies to 2.6 million registered voters who don't affiliate with a party. I'm sure that independents in 18 other states would like to know as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Howard Simon.
Good afternoon. I have a statement that I really would rather not read, and would it be okay if I try to summarize it, but come and give you copies?
Please. Thank you.
Thank you. My lawyer friends and colleagues here has say that I'm asking for permission to approach the bench, Your Honor. So, I'm the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union for the state of Florida. I've been an executive director of state ACLUs now for 39 years. I'm the longest serving ACLU director in the country. I've been director here in Florida for 16 years, was the director in the state of Michigan for 23 years. Here in Florida, we have worked extensively, you would not be surprised to find out, on voting issues, all the way from dealing with Florida's, I think, horrendous lifetime system of lifetime disenfranchisement to the end of the paperless voting technology that we played a crucial role in ending in Florida several years ago. My personal involvement in voting occurred when I and two of my friends represented our college student government in civil rights work in the South, including the 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, crusading for the Voting Rights Act, which makes this week's events even a larger bitter pill to swallow. The establishment of this presidential commission, your appearance here, your existence, your appearance here in Florida, I think is a wonderful, important opportunity for a nonpartisan conversation about voting rights. I think we need to be frank about this, and frankness, I think, dictates the fact that I think, as my colleague said earlier from the League of Women Voters, too much of the battles that we have had have involved two parties and not three parties. The rights of voters have gotten lost in what has been a partisan battle between the political parties for the manipulation of electoral process for some perceived partisan advantage. And it's the rights of voters, I think, that have gotten lost in all of that. So in the shadow of this week's Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder, I think we have to redouble our efforts to find front-end election administration changes in order to avoid post-election lawsuits. And bear in mind that even in his majority opinion, the Chief Justice said that voting discrimination still exists. No one can doubt that. I want to say just before, I'm only going to, there is so much that one can say about voting administration in Florida, but I do have two recommendations I want to focus on in your, what I presume will be the development of best practices that you will provide to lawmakers, state supervisors of elections, and local election administrators. So this following for 2 seconds may not be on the point, but I don't think it's right to have this discussion with a set of blinders on. Florida voters, it was moving here in Florida, if you were here, to see the absolute determination of people to be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote. We're not going to have that taken away from them, and stood in line for 6, 8 hours, hours after the election was over, hours after they knew that the election was over, but determined to cast their ballot. What I want to say is that this did not happen by accident. It did not happen because of a large turnout. It did not happen spontaneously. I think that it has to be acknowledged that what happened in Florida was the direct and predictable result of policy decisions that were made by our legislature and our governor. And that's the last somewhat partisan remark that I will make. But policy decisions that that resulted in shortening of the number of days for early voting, ending the long-standing practice in Florida of same-day address change for people who move from one county to another, loading up the ballot with 11 different constitutional amendments, one of which had as the ballot summary of almost 600 words. These placed extra burdens on all voters and I think overwhelmed election administrators. So what we're dealing with here, I think, were policy decisions, not anything that happened spontaneously or by just a large turnout. I just want to focus on two of the points. I think it's 8 and 9 in your on your agenda. Yes, 8 and 9. I want to focus on provisional ballots and early voting. I want to direct your attention to the study done by two of our excellent colleagues here in Florida, political scientists at the University of Florida, that documented much of what happened in the 2012 election in Florida. 30,000 people submitted provisional ballots, were required to vote by provisional ballots in the state of Florida. That's troubling for quite a number of reasons, one of which is that we have a law in Florida that if a provisional ballot is cast while you're standing in the wrong precinct, though you may be an eligible registered voter, your entire vote is discarded, is required to be discarded, including your vote for statewide or national offices. So that is a very troubling part of the problem. We were part of those that staffed election protection telephones, and what we had heard were, and the most common complaint that we heard were people who had to do battle with election officials and having to be forced to vote by provisional ballot. People had moved, they may have gone to their new address, and they were directed back to their old address, in which case they were forced to vote by a provisional ballot, in which case their vote did not count, or they were allowed to vote at their new address, but they had not yet changed their address to their registration to their new address, and they were required to vote a provisional ballot, in which case their vote was not counted. I think one of the things that has to be discussed here also is, I think, the horrible charade imposed upon voters who may have gone through that experience, 30,000 of them, and left the polling place believing that they participated in American democracy, only perhaps to find out later that their vote did not count. I want to say a little bit about absentee ballots. The study done by the two political scientists I mentioned, Heron and Smith, indicated that in the 2012 election, 28% of all votes cast were done by, well, what used to be called absentee balloting. Now it's vote by mail. You don't have to be absent. You can exercise a preference to vote by mail. That was a 6% increase from the previous presidential election. The trend is going in that direction. Some people may applaud that trend. I worry about that trend. And one of the reasons I worry about that trend is because there is a different standard for review, a heightened standard review for the review of signatures, and which means that more people are going to have their absentee ballots discarded and not counted and will be disfranchised. We're all about, our job is to protect the right to vote and prevent as much disfranchisement as possible. There was a large number of absentee ballots that were not permitted, and there was a disparity. I won't go through the study, I commend that to your reading, but there was a racial disparity in terms of, I think it was 1.5% of African American votes, 0.8% of Hispanic votes, 1.3% of Hispanic votes and 0.8% of white votes that were discounted in absentee balloting. Solutions to that, and let me talk about that. Solutions to that, I think, fall within early voting, and that's one of the two main recommendations in my statement that I want to commend to your attention. Early voting is a cure for lots of the problems that I mentioned and lots of the problems that Florida voters endured. Early voting allows voters to vote anywhere in the county, thereby avoiding the problem of casting a provisional ballot standing in the wrong precinct. Early
Mr.
vote.
Simon, could I ask you just to summarize your testimony?
I'm sorry that I didn't realize I was going on that. I'm just about finished. And early voting creates a cushion of time within which to resolve a problem. And if one needs to vote by provisional ballot, early voting also provides that cushion of time. So we went backwards on early voting. In 2008, there were 15 days of early voting and 96 hours in Florida. The legislature partially gave back some of that. There are now 8 days of early voting and 6 days required, with a number of additional days or hours discretionary. Your convenience of voting in the state of Florida should not depend on where you live. There does need to be some uniformity with regard to the number of early voting days and early voting hours. Thank you for the opportunity
Thank
to
you.
address the commission.
Seth Scolari?
Good afternoon. My name is Seth Sclary. I've been involved in elections since 1952 presidential election, and was involved with Mr. Ginsburg's partner in 1964 presidential election. There are a number of things that have been gone over by some other people, so I won't repeat them. But one of the things that hasn't been talked about is how do you find out what the intent of the voter is in a disputed ballot? When you have an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot, and there is a dispute as to whether the signature is valid. In Florida, we have a canvassing board comprised of a judge and a couple of politicians, and they make the decision. The signature looks good, the signature doesn't look good. And they don't have an expert, and they don't have any way to really come to a just conclusion. And I was thinking that, that there might be a provision in federal law that under those circumstances, that there should be an effort to contact the voter to ask them, did you vote? Is this your signature? And so at least that there is some kind of logical, realistic justification that that person was the voter who cast the vote. Otherwise, it's just up to whim. You know, we'd sit there at a canvassing board and we'd look at the name of the voter. You look at the precinct. Is that one of ours or one of theirs? And you know, I dispute it. It looks good. You know, it's a bad way to do it. So that's one thing that I'd ask you to consider. The other thing is restoration of rights of convicted felons. There was just an article in the Tampa Bay Online, which is a part of the Tampa Bay newspaper, where a woman who was a convicted felon had gone through law school, and she was given the right by the governor and the attorney general on the Florida cabinet, which is the board that can overturn these things, to give her the opportunity to become an attorney. And there's differences in each state. For example, in New York, I believe it's automatic. You automatically, once you've served your time, you get your right to vote back. You don't get the right to carry a gun, but you have the right to vote. Yet in Florida, there was a process that you had to go through, and it was an involved process. And Governor Charlie Crist reduced the time period that was necessary for people to get their rights restored, the time period that they would have to wait before they could make the application. The current governor extended the period and made it a lot longer and make it more difficult. And this becomes another form of voter suppression. So I would ask for you to consider the possibility of having a uniform national restoration of rights so that everybody, after they serve their sentence, gets the right to vote back after a reasonable time, 6 months or a year or whatever. And I think that's only fair. The other thing is, Susan Booker had mentioned it, is that there might be some kind of biometric signature, right? Some kind of biometric way for people who don't have ID, because this is another form of voter suppression. They require people to have IDs. And it's extremely difficult now. If you lose your ID, you can't walk into a federal building, you can't drive, you can't do a lot of things. And it's a real hassle to get it, especially if you have a problem with your birth certificate, you were born out of the country, or something of that nature. So maybe a fingerprint, maybe some other kind of biometric thing, or even if you don't have ID, you can put your fingerprint on the ballot. So there's things to consider. Thank you very much.